Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our panel today on the current crisis in the region. I wear many hats in my daily life. On a personal note, I want to say that I am absolutely horrified by the brutal attacks on innocent Israeli citizens by Hamas. I condemn this atrocious violence. As a mother, I have and always will condemn the killing of innocent civilians, and there is no exception here. I recognize and acknowledge the deep pain and suffering of Israelis today. And it is my sincere hope that my empathy and care for Israeli civilians should not be misperceived as negating my simultaneous empathy and care for Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the West Bank. Equally true, nor should my concern and care for Palestinian civilians negate my simultaneous empathy and care for Israeli civilians. Empathy and care are not zero-sum. We are all victims of this conflict, a conflict that has lasted for too long, that has yet to bring us peace and security, dignity and protection in a future where we can live side by side, and where we as Israelis and Palestinians need not worry about children being murdered before their parents' eyes. Yes, almost 25 years ago, Camp David failed, and for almost a quarter of a century, yes, a quarter of a century, with generations of new Palestinians and Israelis born, little has been done on the international stage to bring peace to Israel and Palestine. When we all know peace is a dedicated, prolonged process that takes tireless years and courageous efforts from the global community. Yes, Camp David did indeed fail, but it is equally true for almost a quarter of a century later, the global community has done very little to bring peace to the region. As Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, I'd like to remind everyone about who we are and what we stand for at our school. We are a united, strong, and compassionate community. We are rallying around Princeton students who have lost friends and family in Israel, and many are still uncertain about the fates of so many loved ones. We are also rallying around Princeton Palestinian students who are also watching their loved ones amidst the bombing in Gaza and are also awaiting news to hear about their family and friends and loved ones. Our community is grieving and in shock. We are traumatized by these horrific developments in the region. But our community is strong. Our steadfast determination and our commitment as a school to serve the nation and all of humanity is a core value that motivates us each and every day. We will stay united as a community that cares for one another, that supports one another, that stands with one another, that respects one another. If we lose sight of these core values, the opponents and enemies of peace will have prevailed. At SPIA, I say this on behalf of every member of our cherished and beloved community, we will never let this happen. Our panel today is an exceptional one, and I am honored to be joined by them. Each of them has worked tirelessly in their careers to advance peace. I also know them as my good friends and trusted colleagues. Their esteem and integrity is unparalleled, and I am honored to have them here with us today. It is our job as a policy school to be at the forefront of sophisticated and informed policy analysis. And we are fortunate to have the leading experts on this topic with us today. With that, I am going to hand this off to my colleague, Razia Iqbal.
Amaney, thank you very much. Hello and welcome to you all joining us from many parts of the world. I'd like to extend my thanks to Dean Amaney Jamal and everyone at SPIA who has helped to put this together. A conversation and discussion which we hope will be the first of several, and one which we sincerely hope will enlighten rather than enrage. And I say this fully aware of how much this issue divides people. And I'm informed, of course, by this platform at Princeton. This is a place of learning, and that presumes that we all want to. We are gathering together at a somber time, a time of profound pain and sorrow. What took place on Saturday, October the 7th, the killing of more than 1,000 Israelis by Hamas in southern Israel, was horrific and has left a nation in deep shock. And that shock extends well beyond Israel. The events have also shattered the status quo and present us with nothing less than a paradigm shift in the long and brutal history of Israel and the Palestinians. On different levels, we are currently in uncharted territory. I have with me on this panel 3 people who have enormous experience, and I'm grateful to all of them for agreeing to share their insights today. 2 are at the School of Public and International Affairs. Salam Fayyad, who is the Daniella Coules Distinguished Visitor in Foreign Affairs and a former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. Dan Kurtzer, who is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies and former United States Ambassador to Israel. And from the United States Peace Institute, we have Yacoubian, who is the Vice President of the Middle East and North Africa Center. Thank you for being here. Let's begin with apprising ourselves of some facts. There are many, but here are just a few. So far, the death toll on the Israeli side, people killed during the Hamas attack on Saturday, stands at 1,300. And on the Palestinian side, since the airstrikes on Gaza immediately after Saturday, more than 1,400. More than 300,000 people have had to leave their homes, though still in Gaza, as there is nowhere for them to go. Some 150 hostages have been taken by Hamas, and the group is threatening to kill 1 every time the Israelis bomb Gaza without warning. The Israelis have compounded the 17-year blockade of Gaza by implementing a full siege on more than 2 million people. That means no fuel, no electricity, no food, nothing is going into Gaza and nothing is leaving. And that will not change, the government says, unless Hamas releases those 150 hostages. And we are now talking about a unity government at war with Hamas. Let's begin with the shock and unprecedented nature of what Hamas did on Saturday, that the group was able to breach the security of a unusually highly securitized border in a high-tech surveillance, intelligence-led and militarized nation is unprecedented. In that context, and from the perspective of Hamas, I underline, this was a successful operation, even though the consequences for Hamas are already dire. Dan Kurtzer, let's start with you, your reaction to what took place on Saturday.
Thank you. Thank you, Razia. I want to start actually with a personal note. I've spent 48 years of my professional life working for peace in the Middle East, studying it, teaching it, writing about it, and serving in the American government during a period when we thought a peace process could actually bring results. I've never seen anything as horrific as what happened on Saturday and this weekend. We've experienced terrorism, we've experienced violence, we've experienced counter-violence. My time in Israel as ambassador was marked by the Palestinian Intifada, an uprising which we assumed was devoted to trying to achieve a breakthrough toward a political solution, an end of occupation, the realization of Palestinian rights. What we saw with Hamas, however, on Saturday was simply a murderous, bloodthirsty, depraved killing spree. And the images that we're watching on social media and on television are beyond belief. Hamas, I used to argue, should be integrated into a peace process. We teach that all the parties to a conflict need to be considered, even the potential spoilers. But I was wrong. Hamas never had an intention to be a party to a peace process. We didn't believe what it wrote in its charter. It really believed that it needed to carry out what it wrote in its charter. And it cannot be a partner for peace. Look, what happened on the weekend was, as you said, Razia, a kind of immediate success for Hamas, an incursion that I think was not imagined by Israeli authorities. Bruce Hoffman, a very noted authority on terrorism, called it a failure of imagination, where the Israeli intelligence and military communities probably saw how much weaponry and capability Hamas had amassed, but did not believe that they would be able to activate a combined arms operation that we saw on Saturday. So in the initial days, Hamas is celebrating. We see celebrations elsewhere in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in other parts of the world, including, amazingly, on some college campuses here in the United States. But we are not even at the beginning of the first act of this tragedy. Israel will later, Razia, let me finish, please.
Yeah.
Israel will later analyze the intelligence and operational failures, and there were many. But in the meantime, Hamas has to be dealt with. And I think, as an American, I'm proud of my government for basically saying both to Hamas and its supporters, we will support Israel in its effort to stop Hamas, and we will support efforts to prevent a widening war through, for example, Hezbollah or Iran.
A lot of what you said in the second half of that answer, we will talk about later in this discussion. Let me just ask you one follow-up question, Dan. I mean, it is arguable, isn't it, that what happened on Saturday fundamentally undermines the perspective that successive Israeli governments have had, that its policy towards Palestinians can be managed with little cost to its own population. That's been blown out of the water now.
I think there's no question that as Israel assimilates the lessons of this experience, one of them will be that its failure to deal more effectively with the Palestinian issue is certainly important. But part of that analysis is also the Palestinian failure to deal with the Palestinian issue, its own dysfunctions, the absence of a Palestinian strategy. Even during the times when I was in government and we saw the beginning of Israeli initiatives to try to bring about dialogue, either rejected or ignored by Palestinians. So there's no heroes here, and there are responsibilities to be shared across the board. But in the meantime, the Palestinians, and I look forward to Salam's views on this, Palestinians have to find a way to disgorge this evil from their midst. Israel will do what it can to decapitate Hamas, but it's up to the Palestinians to make a decision whether or not they want this kind of a depraved, inhuman group in their midst. Just like Israelis who oppose their government policy went out on the streets for 8 months, I'd like to see Palestinians out on the streets telling Hamas that it's unacceptable.
You're referring, of course, to the objections to the judicial reforms inside Israel. Salam Fayyad, you wrote in The Economist magazine that this attack was a case of the expected happening unexpectedly. Explain the context of what you mean by the expected. Salam, are you still with us?
Thank you very much, Razia, for the question. Thank you for moderating this meeting. I also wish to thank Amaney Jamal for having taken the initiative to get us all together to have this discussion at these very difficult times. Honored to be with my co-panelists, Dan and Mona. There's a lot to say, but before anything else, let me associate myself 100% and thank Amaney for her very thoughtful opening remarks in characterizing what has happened. Let there be no doubt in anybody's mind that we all together stand absolutely united in rejecting all kinds of terror and the atrocities. Whoever is committing them, wherever they happen, nothing justifies that kind of wicked violence against civilians anywhere at any time, before, now, or in future. More clarity requires no less. We're all united. We must all be united in this. And one obvious terrible consequence of this, in addition, of course, to the major calamity in terms of loss of life that has happened so far, that's unfolding as we speak, and that's expected to get worse as we go along, unfortunately, for all, is we are in a situation where, once again, what is an absolutely just cause, and that is the Palestinian cause, is now looked at exclusively through the prism of these acts. So, but apart from, the calculus associated with gains and losses and people trying to really exploit this for whatever political gain they may choose to, the fact of the matter is, on grounds of principle, this is to be absolutely rejected. Peace process started more than 3 decades ago on the premise that there is going to be a resolution to this conflict. And that effort was to rest importantly on renunciation of violence and terrorism and all of that sort of thing. And that's how it all began. A key commitment that the PLO took back in 1993 at the signing of the Declaration of Principles was to renounce violence and terrorism and all of that sort of thing. And here we are.
Salam, I
Yes.
wonder, Salam, if you would respond to what Dan
Yes.
Kurtzer was
I will.
saying.
I will.
To what
I will.
extent is there even the possibility of Palestinians rejecting the strategy of Hamas and what they have done?
I will. Let me just say on this now, since you want me really to address this right away, I will do that. What I said about that commitment to nonviolence that was taken, it was key tenet of the peace process at the time, happened against the backdrop of then PLO being considered a terrorist organization. And as you know, and some viewers, as a matter of fact, those who are with us today, the PLO still suffers from that label in terms of our relationship with the United States, even after the peace process and all of that sort of thing. But we do not want to really get into the details right now. And the idea was that if, in fact, the PA were to take on those commitments, in particular with reference to the renunciation of violence, that was going to be recognized as partner in peace. And here the reference, I make a reference specifically to what Dan said about it being impossible to really think of Hamas, for example, a player now as a partner for peace, the impossibility of that happening. But that's what everybody was saying at the PLO at the time. And then we got into this process, then we got to where we are. And I agree with him also on what he said about there not being heroes around, to be honest with you. There is a lot to blame to go around. Amaney said at the outset, how much he lamented the fact that the international community did little to nothing about really changing status quo. There were attempts made, as everybody knows, at really getting things done, but there were also many, many failures and setbacks, and we are where we are. You, Razia, said something about the change of paradigm. Change, yes, but I do not know what kind of paradigm. I mean, we're really ushering into an era of an unknown right now. Only God knows where this is going to really take us. And on the question of no heroes and responsibilities, if I stood on any platform before personally, it was I always wanted to look inward and ask always the question what it is that we Palestinians can do to advance our just cause for freedom and promote it and serve it well. So I accept that. I accept that to be starting with conversation on anything going forward. I did before and I do now. The question of what do we do? And it's so difficult against the backdrop of the horrific events of what happened, not only on Saturday, what is unfolding as we speak, and what is likely to get a lot worse going forward. And we know that. It's very difficult to say, but on the other hand, and having said that, to be honest with you. But we are a public policy school, and I agree with what Amaney said about our role and responsibility. We have to really deal with public policy issues, the policy issues associated with this, and address these questions as best as we can, knowing that we really cannot at all under any condition be removed from what's going on.
Let
so
me
if the starting point, just one thought, if the starting point is going to be we need to get rid of Hamas first before anything can happen. It's one thing to denounce, terrorism. But if the proposition is we need to really get rid of Hamas before anything can happen, I do not know how that is really going to be achievable. Again, I do not want to really repeat what I said. The parallel between where the PLO was and what it was considered, and what some still consider it today, by the way, and where Hamas has been and is today. No matter what happens, we know Hamas is a political movement, and as such, even if Israel launches, as it appears to really be out to do, this ground offensive and they go for everything and anything that is Hamas, there will remain the ideology, the ideas that Hamas stands on. And Hamas cited a number of grievances, at the time they first talked about the operation, the attack on Israel on Saturday. The truth is, whatever it is they said, and some more are Palestinian grievances. So, end of the day, even if all of what is said about the need to really get rid of Hamas happens, there still will be the need to deal with the underlying causes of this and the underlying grievances. And these are not Hamas only grievances, these are Palestinian grievances, and they are the grievances of any and all who are interested in really seeing this region coming to a better place for both Israelis and Palestinians alike. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Okay, let me turn to Mona Yacoubian. We have heard from the unity government in Israel saying that they want to completely eradicate Hamas. Hamas is being equated with ISIS, and Benjamin Netanyahu has asked the world to support him in getting rid of this group. But as Salam has pointed out, this is a political movement. In your assessment, even if the Israelis go in on the ground offensive, the soldiers are massing, we know that they almost certainly will in the next few days go into Gaza for the ground offensive. Politically, strategically, if they get rid of every single Hamas leader, what will take its place? What will happen to the political movement? In what way is this strategy one that might work for Israel?
Thank you, Razia, and let me thank Princeton University and Dean Amaney Jamal for inviting me, and let me also note that I'm honored to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues. And let me also just express my own personal sense of grief and sadness at the time, the very tragic time that we all find ourselves in. I would say that Salam was correct in saying expected at an unexpected moment. And there is something, though, very significant and game-changing about this time. And indeed, we are in uncharted waters. And I think that can't be underscored enough. And I think we need to honestly, I hope through the course of this panel, understand more deeply and more rigorously what exactly this moment means before we think about how to go ahead. Look, my own sense is eradication policies rarely, if ever, work. And one can understand why it is that the Israeli government feels the way it does, given the horrific nature of the violence, the atrocities that were committed, indeed the ISIS-like tactics, and yet underneath that are a people and are civilians in Gaza and in the West Bank with aspirations. And so, so my own sense is I think certainly that this was at best, if even, a Pyrrhic victory for Hamas. But at the same time, I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for Israel to resolve this challenge purely through military might and purely through a policy of seeking to eradicate the movement of Hamas. And I think there lies before us the challenge of how we think about this going forward. And if I could just say, Razia, I also think I think maybe it was Dan who said, we're at the beginning of the beginning. And I think that's exactly right. And, we don't know where this is going. And I do want to put on the discussion table here how we think about containing even this conflict to the extent possible and not allowing it to explode into a regional conflagration that includes Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and I think that's a real possibility, and I hope we can talk about that. And so I think that's another piece of this that we must keep our eyes on, and also, frankly, and I say this as an analyst with enormous humility, at just how quickly evolving and complex this situation is, and also that we're dealing with it with honestly, I think, an unprecedented level of disinformation and social media channels that are being exploited by various forces to further provoke and stoke tensions in a very, very dangerous way.
Thank you very much, Mona. I do really want to get on to the potential for this becoming a bigger regional conflict in just a moment. But can we just stay with the possibility of what might happen in the next few days, what might happen in the next few weeks? Dan Kurtzer, can I turn to you now? In the context of the ground war that feels inevitable, to what extent do you think there is a framework within which Israel can at least mitigate the damage that it might do to civilians? We know how many have been killed already. The sympathy of many, many, many countries in the world is with Israel at the moment. But we are hearing voices from the United Nations. Volker Turk, the UN human rights chief, said that what Israel was already doing in Gaza was collective punishment. I wonder what your take is on this.
It's absolutely not collective punishment, with all due respect to the United Nations. Mona is right that it is impossible to destroy a movement. The ideas behind Hamas are going to remain. It is, however, not only possible, but required now to kill or capture as many Hamas operatives as possible, to destroy its infrastructure, and to set back that movement for as many years as we possibly can. And why? Because smart diplomacy will use those years to build something different, to rebuild Gaza and bring in a Palestinian leadership, or to evoke a Palestinian leadership that's ready to do for the people and not use the people as human shields, which is exactly what Hamas is doing right now. The civilian casualties in Gaza occur because Hamas hides in the basements of hospitals and schools and UN facilities. So destroying as much as we can of Hamas's infrastructure and its personnel should give the international community the opportunity to do what Amaney said at the outset, which is to act aggressively and forcefully to fill that void with something positive. Palestinians need to make that decision. They need to bring about a government, a leadership that's ready to do the right thing in Gaza. The international community has to stand behind it. When that happens in Gaza, and if the West Bank sees this happening and East Jerusalem, maybe we can get back to a point where we can restore an idea of negotiations. Now, we're not there yet. We're not even close. But you can't do that now with Hamas lurking in the background, Islamic Jihad lurking in the background, Hezbollah lurking in the background, believing that what happened on Saturday was a success.
Salam, Fayyad, listening to Dan Kurtzer, what's your view of the possibility that if the leadership of Hamas is destroyed in this offensive that we are about to see, the airstrikes are continuing, what is the likelihood that there could be a galvanizing of the Palestinian Authority? I mean, we have to bear in mind that Hamas was voted in back in 2006, and they have not had elections since. But the point he's making is there the potential for a different kind of Palestinian leadership to take over from Hamas?
Unfortunately, the path to it that has been suggested now as a possibility, I think absent all other alternatives, and I'm sure Dan and I have known each other for a long period of time. What I say here is not something that you wouldn't be able to relate to. We talk to each other all the time. Is going to really come at a very high cost. That's number one. And number two, what guarantee there is going to be is there for that to lead to an outcome? The question, therefore, is there another way? Is there another way? I mean, Dan actually sketched a scenario that is much talked about these days as leading possibly, maybe, to us getting to a point where we could have another go at it, having tried to do this for about 3 decades with not much success, actually with abject failure. And I'm doubtful, to be honest with you. And I have my doubt that this is a strategy that we can take us anywhere. One thing, as he rightly pointed out, this is an ideology, and the grievances are there, and they were there before Saturday, and they cited them and recited them, and everybody's saying the same thing. Nothing justifies what happened. I agree. I know that. But this is a political movement, and political movements do this kind of thing. They align themselves with where they think people are based on their perception of what they think people's grievances are. They own them, and they then act in this way destructively, and we know what the outcome is going to be based on where we are right now. Now, to think that that is the way to really get the Palestinians to the point where we have a different leadership that's better positioned to engage in a meaningful way, apart from this as being extremely costly. I talk to people all the time, and to be honest with you, I just don't know for how much longer it's going to be possible to still have connection with people I knew there, and I know there, and they're there. Total displacement, fear, death and destruction as we speak. So this is an extremely costly endeavor in human terms, and no one can be indifferent to that. Secondly, we all know, I'm sure we all know, that, look, there's failure, and we take our share of responsibility for that. I say that. I'm speaking for myself. I know our own weaknesses, and as a matter of fact, factionalism has been extremely destructive for us. There's no question about that. We know it at every level. But we're not really the only party that has contributed to this failure. When things got aligned, when people thought that there was an alignment that possibly could lead us somewhere, things didn't happen. It was not only because there were Palestinian failures. I myself, with all honesty, can tell you, looking back at what was agreed and what was said about what was agreed, I'm talking about also here, whether in fact that really truly held the promise of a state with attributes in terms of sovereignty, in terms of territory, in terms of where Jerusalem was in it, that came close to anything that the Palestinians would consider acceptable. So we're really going at it for about 30 years, essentially chasing a mirage of it. Now, when you add the violence to what happened, when you add the events that unfolded over the past 20 plus years now, and the loss of trust and confidence and all of that, you see where people were. And that's what I had in mind when I said the expected happening, unexpected in terms of point in time. At the scale it did happen, but there is this failure, everybody recognizes it. Hamas gone, let's just assume that happens, like as a structure. Those grievances are valid and they're real, they need to be dealt with. And any leadership for the Palestinian people coming forward will not be able to abstract from the experience of the past 3 years. Even if we really do all of those things, number one, are we at all, do we have any degree of assurance that we're really going to get a state that we really can call home in a meaningful way? Are we going to really get to a point where Israel would, much like the way, in the same spirit that the PLO recognized its right to exist as a state in peace and security in 1993, would we ever get recognition by the state of Israel of any of our national rights as a people, right? Right to that state on the territory Israel occupied in 1967. When you really consider all of these factors and the rhetoric coming from Israeli officialdom, I'm talking about the current government, officers of that government saying what they're saying about not there ever being possibility of Palestinian statehood, but not even the Palestinian Authority, they would want to really see continue. What kind of really platform is a future Palestinian leadership that has the right mindset in terms of really wanting to really get to a point of peaceful accommodation? What kind of platform will it be able to stand on in terms of really getting people to subscribe to this new paradigm? If we really do all of those things and perform perfectly, is there really going to be a meaningful promise of us really getting to a point where we can have our aspirations fulfilled? These are really serious challenges. They need to be dealt with. One last point here. If we now have at a point where the escalation is ongoing and it's going to really get a lot worse based on everything we know, I ask the question, is there anything that can be done now, multi-stage something, that could slow this down a little bit so there is room for diplomacy to find a way out of this? And what I have in mind specifically, for example, people who are held hostage, is there anything that can be done, like looking at this analytic, something that could really slow this down a little bit, where something can happen there in terms of a deal of sort that really would secure, would deal with that situation, or the promise of that, to at least give people reason for a pause. And when that happens, give diplomacy a chance to find the formula where we Palestinians can get our house in order, and in terms of what we really need to do to be able to really get ourselves out of what is, by all indication, a path that is leading to assured destruction for certain.
Let's turn to Mona Yacoubian. Mona, what in your view, what space in your view exists that might allow for countries that would possibly get involved in some diplomacy in the way that Salam is suggesting to focus on the issue of hostages, which might allow everyone to pause? Because the retribution, Israel's agony has resulted in such swift retribution and such a swift response that it feels as though there isn't any space for anyone to take a breath and pause. And I wonder whether you think there is any capacity for that in this moment.
Well, I think this is a particularly fraught moment. And on one hand, I would certainly associate myself with Dan's analysis. Now is not the time from Israel's perspective for ceasefires, diplomacy, et cetera, in terms of the imperative that Israel feels to respond to the atrocities that have taken place. At the same time, and maybe this is why I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace, I also am sympathetic to Salam's point, and I think he's absolutely right. When we can't find space for diplomacy and negotiations on the core issues, it is indeed important to look at whether there are de-escalatory measures. And I think the hostage question is front and center. Because what happens with those hostages, to my mind, is going to be a key indicator of where this conflict goes. So if there is a way for diplomacy to take place with respect to the hostages, and here I think Qatar has a very important role to play, that's important to pursue and understand. Because quite frankly, the alternative is going to be horrific and very difficult to contemplate in terms of what the implications of that are, which is to say that Hamas makes good on its promises to start to execute hostages, which would dramatically escalate this conflict. The other point, Razia, I would make is the humanitarian issues and questions as to whether there are corridors that can be opened up. Are there ways to ensure, I mean, there are ways of addressing conflict. There are laws that govern how conflict is undertaken. And so those are some of the kind of, I don't know, secondary or subsidiary issues where one could potentially see diplomacy playing a role. And quite honestly, if I could just say my last point, and I think demonstrating that diplomacy can make a difference even on issues that are not core to the conflict in and of itself is important. And the last thing I'll say is it's going to be critical to try to cauterize this conflict, to try to insulate other parts of the region, other parts of Israel, of the West Bank, as I said earlier, Lebanon and the broader region of getting wrapped up in a much bigger conflagration, which will have even greater implications for peace and stability in the region.
I will come back to you on that wider conflagration and the potential for that in a moment. I just want to remind people that if they have questions to ask, do please put them in the chat. We will make some time at the end of our discussion to come to you. Dan Kurtzer, what's your view of how crucial the issue of the hostages is likely to be in the next few days?
Look, having served in Israel twice during my career, this is one of the top emotional issues on an Israeli agenda. It always has been. It's under the rubric of leaving no one behind on the battlefield or in this situation. I agree with Mona and the elements that Salam said. If we want to see the beginning of a de-escalation, it can start with a Hamas decision to release unconditionally and unilaterally civilian hostages, the women, the children, and the men who are not in uniform. They can make the argument that the action of taking them hostage was illegitimate in Islam. They can make the argument that they will hold soldiers. We don't support that. That's an argument that they can make and they've made in the past. But for them to expect anyone to negotiate seriously, not only when they're holding women, children, and civilians generally, but using them as shields, putting them in harm's way, makes no sense. And as a government, there would be no support for the kind of negotiation that we've seen take place in the past. You remember Israel was willing to hand over to Hamas over 1,000 prisoners for one Israeli soldier. It was criticized at the time. Probably half of those people went back into the business. Some of them may be dead now because they were part of this operation. But that was a soldier. And soldiers, they put themselves in harm's way, they fight. But civilians, women and children, no. So I agree. Let's start with that. Let the people who have some influence on Hamas in Iran and elsewhere tell them to do this tomorrow. I agree with Mona that we also need to think about humanitarian areas or access or safe spots where the population can hunker down while the fighting goes on. And those two issues, I think, can begin a de-escalation. I'm not optimistic about them, but that's where we may need to start.
I mean, anyone who knows the geography of the Gaza Strip will know that when you talk about people being put in harm's way, in the last 6 days, we have seen more than 6,000 bombs being dropped on this heavily populated strip of land. And I wonder, Salam, Fayyad, what you make of even the possibility of Hamas even contemplating what is being suggested here in this discussion.
So I said it first, and I think it's on the minds of many, as is evident by the fact that we on the panel converge on the importance of this point as a starting point for de-escalation. It's on our mind. I'm sure others are thinking about it, and I most certainly hope so in answer to your question. And if that is not happening already, it is my hope that regional partners, would play that role and make that suggestion and begin to really move in this direction. As I look at the landscape now, when we're talking about escalation to come, we're living it.
Who would that regional partner be, Salam? Give us some idea of who that could be in the current climate.
I mean, you know, the players who are actively involved in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict directly on an ongoing basis, we know who they are. Egypt and Jordan in the main, but of course, you know, there's Saudi Arabia, there's Qatar, UAE, the 4 Arab countries that entered into normalization agreement with Israel back in 2020. Now is the time to really be making a move to really see if there's something that can be done. Between the countries I mentioned, I believe there are some who may be better positioned than others, given their relationship to Hamas, and they can do that, and they should be encouraged to do that. Part of the diplomacy internationally that is supposed to take place, and I hope some of it is taking place actually, would be to make that suggestion. If it has not been made already, I'll be utterly surprised if that has not happened, to be honest with you, because that really cannot be just starting point just to really get things going. I can't think of any other way to really begin this process of de-escalation. We continue to talk about escalation if it's yet to happen. I know on the path we are on right now, things are going to get devastatingly worse relative to where we are today. But where we are today is on pace to really surpassing, even if things were to stop very quickly, anything that has happened over the 5 rounds of escalation that took place in and around Gaza since late 2008 already. So add to that what is being talked about as maybe part of the solution. Displacement is something that is a word that's being used for the first time now. When you really compare basically what's being said now with what was said during the said 5 rounds of escalation that I referred to, now the displacement is an issue. I talk to people that are moving, but where are they moving? This is a tiny enclave, 260 miles square. And so there is the concern that actually this could mean eventually people rushing south in tens of thousands in direction of Rafah crossing. We know what the Egyptians have said about this, but will they be able to hold the line on that? Would they be willing to hold the line in the face of something like this happen? We've seen this happen elsewhere in the region. Look at Syria, for example, and what happened to neighboring countries, whether Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and through Turkey to Europe and the rest of it. So we have seen this happen before, and there is serious fears that something like this could very well happen if, in fact, the next step in this escalation, ground escalation, takes place. And in the way that people are talking about ground operation, as best as I can read between the lines, this is not really going to be a 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, few week kind of operation. Some are speculating that this actually could take the form of very long-term presence in Gaza until something happens to that is satisfactory from the point of view of Israel. The question is there something that can be done to really change the direction of this trajectory, or slow it down a little bit to really give room for some activity that could lead to better outcomes.
You have said it several times now, Salam, the possibility of slowing things down. Mona Yacoubian, I wonder if you will just jump in here now and reflect for us on the possibility that now is not, there is no space at the moment, that the possibility of a conflagration becoming even bigger regionally is greater today than it was even 2 days ago. On Sunday, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal that said that Iran had helped Hamas to plan what they did on Saturday, October the 7th. The United States said that they had not seen any evidence to that effect. And today we are seeing a report that says that Iran has been denied access to that $6 billion, which was negotiated in order to get hostages released from Iran, and that the Qataris and the US have decided that Iran is not going to get that money? That feels as though it is likely to provoke the region much more than anything that has happened in the last day or so in that context, in terms of the regional involvement.
Well, I think, Razia, you're correct. I mean, each day that goes by and each level of unanticipated outcomes that may take place does indeed potentially raise the prospects of a broader regional conflagration. And I would bring in, though, the issues around misinformation, disinformation. So yesterday, as a perfect example, those of us that watch very closely, and I think that the key border to keep our eyes on is Israel's northern border with Lebanon. That is where there's the greatest fear that a second front could open up. And it felt as though yesterday across the Twitter sphere and elsewhere, there was word that indeed this had started, that Hezbollah had initiated attacks, more significant attacks. There has been skirmishing across that border, I should note, since Sunday or Monday. There have been 3 Hezbollah operatives killed by Israel. There's been an Israeli officer killed. So there's activity, but it's skirmishes and it's limited. What I would argue is it is not, I do not believe Hezbollah sees it in its interest to open a second front with Israel. On the contrary, I think Hezbollah understands that they understand all too well what will happen to Lebanon and the mass devastation that the country could expect in the event of an attempt to broaden the conflict to Lebanon. And we see Hezbollah largely as a rational actor. Lebanon itself is in the throes of an unprecedented economic, social, political, and humanitarian crisis. This is a country that was once a solidly middle-income country that has poverty rates now reaching toward 80%, that has food insecurity. And Hezbollah knows that its own status in the country would be endangered if it brings wrath through a massive conflict onto the heads of the Lebanese people. I would also note it was about a year ago, we shouldn't forget, that with US negotiation and mediation, Israel and Lebanon negotiated a permanent maritime border. That was viewed as a very important de-escalation move. Implicit in that was Hezbollah's recognition of Israel. And why did Hezbollah essentially allow that negotiation to go forward? It's the same dynamic I just laid down. Their understanding that it would be very difficult for them to tolerate with their own constituents standing in the way of that negotiation. So I don't think it's in Hezbollah's interest. However, things can change rapidly. We don't know what a ground incursion would look like. We don't know if there is intelligence that comes out and evidence that comes out that ties Iran quite directly to the attacks on Saturday, in which case Israel would certainly feel the need to respond. These are all unknowns, plus this issue of misinformation, disinformation, and unintended escalation, which is exactly how the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon kicked off. One other point I feel compelled to make, which is there's another front that could open up, which is with Syria. We already see that Syria is the most active arena for the shadow war that has now gone on for years between Israel and Iran. And Syria has become an increasingly active zone of conflict. Today, Israel bombed both the Damascus and Aleppo airports, disabling both airports as the Iranian foreign minister was en route to Damascus and his plane was turned around. Now, that would sound shocking if one wasn't following. If you don't follow Syria closely, that sounds pretty shocking. That's actually not so far from the norm as of the past few years. So we shouldn't forget that Syria already is an active arena, but it could become even more so, or there could be more hostilities initiated from the Israeli side of the Golan. And that would be something else to watch for in terms of, again, the potential that this becomes a multi-front war. But again, my own view, I don't think any regional stakeholders, any of the regional actors see it in their interest to escalate this to that level. They understand, I think, almost what I would call the mutually assured destruction that would take place.
Dan Kurtzer, let's turn to some questions from the audience. Before what happened on Saturday took place, with the backing of the United States, Saudi Arabia and Israel were moving towards a pretty significant rapprochement. The question that has just been put up is, how will what's happening now affect the possibility of a peace accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and indeed Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel?
Well, I think it's for sure that in the short term, the idea of Saudi-Israeli normalization is on hold. Everyone will want to see how the situation evolves. The dust will have to settle. Once that dust settles, national self-interest will kick back in, and we may have an opportunity to revive the idea of increasing formal contacts between Arab states and Israel. The Saudis have demonstrated a very serious self-interest in promoting that kind of relationship for their own reasons, their own security reasons, and those are not going to go away as a result of the Gaza situation. But to the extent that this was one of the targets of Hamas and potentially Iran to stall and maybe undercut the Saudi-Israeli deal, it will succeed in the short term, and we'll have to see what happens, as I say, once the dust settles.
Salam, a question for you from the audience, since we were speaking earlier about the possibility of minimizing casualties from Israel's response in Gaza. How feasible is evacuation? And there probably is only one way that it can go, which is the Rafah crossing with Egypt. And is that where evacuees would go? Is Egypt willing to take them? Because currently people who have been displaced, internally displaced in Gaza, have nowhere to go except somewhere else in Gaza.
Experience suggests that this is a very difficult thing to do. And by that, I mean holding the line on thousands of people rushing, escaping for their lives, running for their lives, essentially, is an extremely difficult thing to do. And if you look at migration generally, under conditions that are much less stressful than what we see happening in Gaza, it's very difficult to stave off waves of migration. And that has been going on all the time. So against the backdrop of what is expected to happen, unless something happens to really trip the process, that's going to be very difficult to stop. Gaza, again, is a very small place, and it's not like it's easy for people to find refuge or shelter within the strip itself. Everybody knows how small it is. So it's unlikely, even if Egypt's declared position that they're going to really hold the line on this. I try to think about what that might mean in practical terms. In the event people start rushing toward that southern border, I just don't know if that line can stand. And so more likely than not, that's what's going to happen. This is part of, I think, the broader regional picture that Mona talked about, and I agree with her, as a matter of fact, in terms of the overall assessment of where interests are and the kind of lower probability that she associates with a major eruption in the region. There are two things I would like to really introduce to the conversation here. One, that may very well be true, and I agree. But then, should the low probability event happen, it's a very catastrophic. It's one of those things that, it may not be highly likely or likely that further regional or region-wide escalation take place, but if it does happen, it could be disastrous. And so even if it may be a low probability event, we need to worry about it. There is a second dimension was talked about in terms of regional implications. and that is the normalization with Saudi Arabia. Up until last Saturday, that's what most analysts were preoccupied with. And it was rumored to be about to happen and all of that. And there was talk about the need for there to be a meaningful Palestinian component, people engage in this kind of conversation. Well, maybe there is an opportunity here for there to be a Palestinian component in the kind of conversation that could be taking place regionally. And when I said Saudi Arabia amongst the countries that could have an input in trying to really get us to a point of de-escalation, I had that kind of really thing in mind, even before there is normalization of formal way or something like this. As Saudi Arabia has signaled as of late greater interest in getting involved in Palestinian affairs, this is an opportunity to really throw its weight and see what it can do to contribute to this. My last point on the regional implications, possible instability in the region, not in the form of an eruption, meaning conflict, but if you look, for example, so far, there have been demonstrations in neighboring countries, and as and when things deteriorate even further in the days ahead, how are governments in neighboring countries going to be able to deal with that dynamic in their own countries? It is not, we're not talking about the region-wide conflict, but we're talking about elements of serious instability that could obtain in the absence of a convincing effort to try to really slow this thing down.
A question really then for Mona Yacoubian. I mean, one of the members of the audience has said, how will the Palestinians survive without water and electricity? And where can they go when they're asked to leave if the border is closed? The context of what Salam has just been talking about, the demonstrations that have occurred in at least one of the countries that signed the Abraham Accords in Bahrain, and the kind of response that Saudi Arabia gave in the immediate aftermath of what took place on Saturday, does force us to at least consider the response, as Salam is outlining, of what happens in the Arab street, and to what extent can leaders in regional countries deal with the fact that for many, many decades, the Israel-Palestinian issue was the single most important issue. And of course, that has shifted over the years. So Mona, what do you make of the way in which people are watching what's happening in terms of the suffering of the people in Gaza?
It's a very important question, and let me associate myself again with Salam. I agree that while it's unlikely, if a regional conflagration were to occur, the implications would be enormous. The question you just raised, Razia, and I think Salam was also touching on, we're going to know a lot tomorrow, because tomorrow in Friday prayers, there have been calls across the region for a day of rage. And we are already getting indications from various countries across the region, in North Africa, in the Levant, in Jordan, in Lebanon, etc., that tomorrow could be a momentous day. We're going to understand much better how the Arab street reacts to what has happened. And I suspect that this is going to become, we're going to get in, unfortunately, into a pattern of the region responding to whatever takes place on the ground between Israel and Gaza. So that if there is, for example, a significant ground incursion and massive civilian casualties, we will see knock-on effects in terms of demonstrations and protests across the Arab world. I think that is to be expected. That is something we all need to watch for. And it's going to tell us a lot about the extent to which this issue still resonates or not with the Arab street.
We are drawing to a close, but I want to give Dan Kurtzer the last word in some respects for us to return to Israel, and a country that is coming to terms with the most devastating thing that has happened to it since its foundation. I wonder, Dan Kurtzer, if you will just reflect for us on how the country might come to terms with what has happened, given that before it had happened, it was a very polarized country, that there were people who did not approve of this extreme right-wing coalition led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And then the events of Saturday took place, and we are seeing a very different Israel.
One of the things that we know Israel does well, which is an unfortunate reality, is commissions of inquiry. After major events and traumatic events, the Israelis look in the mirror and they try to figure out what went wrong. There will be a commission of inquiry, I'm sure. Some of it will focus on the intelligence and operational failures, but some of it will also focus on the political failures, not just with respect to what happened this past weekend, but some of the issues we've been talking about here. What were Israel's responsibilities, for example, over the last year, with a very extreme coalition that sought not only judicial overhaul, but also some 200 bills on the Knesset slate that would effectively continue to annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So I think there's going to be a coming to grips over time, hopefully over a short period of time. I'm not sure that the current political leadership in Israel can survive. If 1973 is any example, Golda Meir could not survive the aftermath of this consideration. I think many Israelis will be happy if the current coalition collapses entirely. And one of the important issues that needs to be factored into the Commission of Inquiry and the internal debate will be what happens with Palestinians. We live with them, we live next door to them, they live among us. They want independence, they want the end of occupation, they want rights, they want the same considerations that Israelis have. And that's, I think, needs to be on the agenda and hopefully will be on the agenda once this war comes to an end.
As I said at the beginning of this discussion, this, we hope, will be the first of several that we will have in the coming days and weeks, most unfortunately because of the way things are developing on the ground. My thanks now, though, to Dan Kurtzer, to Salam Fayyad, and to Mona Yacoubian. And thank you all for being with us, for listening, for absorbing what has been really very, very difficult for many, many people. And as Salam has said time and again, that the days to come may well be even more difficult. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I'm going to hand over to Dean Amaney Jamal.
Thank you so much, Razia. Thank you all for your analysis, your insights, and your take on what's going to happen, what options we might have available to us as a policy community to address this ongoing crisis on the ground. And with that, as Razia mentioned, we're going to continue holding a series of panels that will provide critical analytical analysis on what's going on. So please stay tuned. Again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the team. I really appreciate your time. With that, thank you.